So Aishatu, I'm really excited to have you on board because you're talking about all the things that are near and dear to my heart. So
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm so excited. This is a topic that was really important for me, especially as I think it is a very timely topic with all the political situations going on right now about diversity and being more inclusive. So I believe with post-colonial innovation and design, a framework that I'm working on, that we can have a different conversation, that we can change the narrative and design futures that are desirable and that include a whole lot of group of people. So I'm very excited to talk about this.
yeah, it's interesting. So Mark Nelson and I we've been working on peace innovation for 11, 12 years now. It's like, okay, so we passed the halfway mark because we always say we're halfway, 10 years into a 20-year journey. So now we're 12 years into a 20-year journey. So hopefully we'll get,
Wow,
things will
congratulations.
start. But one of the concerns we had from the very beginning was the power dynamics within the innovation sector, right? And certainly when Mark was a relief worker in Sudan and in Ethiopia during the famine and civil war there in the 80s, he was able to see firsthand some of the unintended consequences of humanitarian aid, of people who were very well intentioned, who wanted to do good, and yet they ended up either perpetuating the harm on the ground, or because they were adding fuel to it, because they were distorting market signals in terms of the economy, or the power dynamic of people coming from the West saying, I have all this knowledge and solutions, and I'm just going to impose this solution on you. And certainly at Stanford, we are vulnerable to that as well, and we see that with our students. And I sometimes would cringe when I would look at final projects and we're like, okay, you've done desk research on this and maybe you traveled to that place, but if you don't include people in the community as part of the design team, then you're still objectifying them. And that is a really, it's embedded in design thinking, and it wasn't done from a place of malice, but it was just a blind spot that the West has, that the way we do things must de facto be the best, or because we're educated, we know more than you. And being part of an ethnic minority in the United States, I find that terribly annoying because I go, well, actually, we're not stupid. We may not have resources, but that doesn't mean we don't understand what the problem is, right?
Exactly. And often
So
those places are treated as if they are the problem. So I believe with post-colonial innovation and design, it can help us to reimagine something beyond the status quo of what we think or what we define as design thinking. So we should ask ourselves really, who has ownership over the design process? Who defines success, you know? And also who is included and who is excluded. So for me, also, it is important maybe to start by explaining what I mean by post-colonialism.
yes.
It's something that examines how societies, governments, and people in the formerly colonized regions experience, for instance, different relations to each other. So the use of the word post in post-colonial doesn't actually mean that the colonial impact has finished, that it is over. Rather, it highlights how colonialism continues to impact us and shapes the way that we think, the way knowledge is perceived, and who is marginalized and who's not marginalized. So I think in order to have a better understanding of what post-colonial thinking can do for design thinking, it is important to understand that it looks at not only tries to understand how the world is, but how it should be. And it is concerned about understanding the different disparities of power, what you mentioned also earlier, to be aware of how Western knowledge has been defined as a universalizing concept. So by doing so, we are actually excluding a lot of interesting other ways of thinking, which could enrich the design process as a designer. What you mentioned even, if you want to design humanitarian intervention or another kind of intervention, you should try to always keep in mind the historical origins that lie also in this kind of power dynamics, and to always try and understand and to not design for somebody, but to design with and for each other.
Mm-hmm.
So what post-colonial thinking also tries to show, for instance, everybody knows this sentence by the philosopher René Descartes, who said, "I think, therefore I am." And from a post-colonial lens, this has like real implications, because it says, it defines that who he thinks exists and who does not think, or is not perceived as a thinking being, is an object and does not think. And I find it interesting how that was kind of used as a means to explain why it was possible to subjugate other indigenous or non-Western cultures, because they were perceived as non-thinking, as not being the same on the same level. So if you look at this idea of separating the subject from the object, it also kind of creates a disconnect to other beings, to other human beings who are perceived as being inferior. So when you include other ways of thinking, for instance, there's this decolonial thinker was called Walter Mignolo. He said, "I am where I think, and I think where I am." So where you are is how you think. And yeah, I think this is important.
Yeah, it's you know, so my ancestors also are sort of a result of colonialism, and certainly in Mexico, when the Europeans came to the Americas, you know, Mexico was one of the first places that was impacted in terms of the indigenous people. And so there's this interesting fusion and tension even within ourselves, within our DNA, within who we are, because we are both the colonizer and the colonized. And that's embodied, you know, in us. And so it makes an interesting tension in terms of how you move your way forward. And when the Spanish were coming to the Americas, there was philosophical debate about how to treat the indigenous people. And, you know, it was a theological debate of, did they have souls?
Exactly.
If those indigenous people had souls, that means that they could be saved, right? They could be converted to Christianity, in which case they needed to be treated in a different way than if they did not have souls. So it's almost like, are they a thing or are they a human? And it's interesting, even to this day, in terms of human rights, we continue to have this debate, like, are you entitled to have human rights if you are transgender or LGBTQ or you name it, right? And we keep on, and we're going like, well, I'm human, so that it's almost like you have to defend your human traits, your humanity. And at least in the West, we still look at people as commodities, like they are not valued for their intrinsic humanity, but rather their economic utility, as if they were, what is your output? If you create value, then you must be valuable. And if you don't create value economically, then you are worthless. And so then we put you in a different category and you're less than. And certainly that's with humans, much less imagine, and certainly in the Christian hierarchy of God, man, animals, and man has dominion over nature. So again, it's that dominance. And one of the things that you've been looking at also is how you shift things from being human-centered to being environment-centered as well. So colonialism isn't just about humans, right? It's about, it's a sort of like a system, systematic way of thinking about how we interact with something other than ourselves.
I think especially what you mentioned just now, the shift from human-centered design to environment-centered design it changes everything, because human-centered design looks at the system in terms of a pyramid, you know. So you have the human being on top, and then all the other beings and plants are underneath. So this has implications, because I think it's even problematic, the word human-centered, because it means that we only focus on the human and their needs, their experiences. However, by shifting towards an environment-centered approach, you have more of a circle, because everyone is inside, everyone is equal, and all the needs, not only the human needs, are being looked at. We try, by doing this, also expand the actors. So we don't always only look at human beings as an actor, but for instance, right now, the most important actor is COVID, right? So
Yeah.
a virus. So we need an approach that looks into all the different actors that exist, humans or non-humans, whether it's the land, whether it's air, whether it's water, whether it's environment, whether it's animals. We're losing a lot of biodiversity right now, climate change, in order to design solutions that cater to the needs and listen to what the environment needs. This can really change the narrative and help us to create solutions that are not only short term but also long term. And that is one of the many advantages of looking of incorporating environment-centered approach, because I believe it can help us to not only design for solutions for the now, here and now, but it helps us to design long term, which means 10, 20 years into the future, and to also incorporate different ways of imagining desirable futures. So what I mean by that is also that in terms of actors, one thing that I wanted to mention as well is that we should include future generations. That changes the narrative altogether. Imagine if you incorporated future generation, imaginary future generations into the empathy map, you know, one of the many tools that are used in the design process, and to include them throughout, you know, to imagine what if you had future generations included in the design process. And for instance, there's this indigenous tribe that only thinks or develops all their actions thinking 7 generations into the future. So whenever they decide something, these 7 generations are beside them. So I think this is a very powerful kind of concept to incorporate these future generations in our whole design process or decision making, because it will change everything altogether. There's this really interesting experiment that I read about in Japan. And this philosopher, what he did, he made this experiment. He had like 2 groups of 3, and in each group of 3 there was one person representing a future generation. So they were giving 2 choices. Choice A was they would be given a large amount of money, but future generations would become $9 less. The second choice was they would receive considerably less, but future generations would have the choice between A and B unchangeably. So this was a real interesting experiment, because the future generation and the current generation were kind of in a conversation with each other, negotiating which choice to choose. And each one had to be in the future generation. They did different turns, and it changed how they decided. And most of them decided for choice B, because obviously they put themselves into the shoes of future generations, and then were able to really empathize and understand the need also that has to be kept in mind. So I find that very interesting.
I think about how that would collide so hard with the way Western capitalism, especially in the United States, is currently done, the model, which is quarterly, right? We don't think, it's hard to think a year ahead. much less 7 generations ahead, because at least in public markets, you're driven by these quarterly numbers. And that is a fiction, that is a utilitarian fiction, that is a game we have all chosen to play. And the rules are designed that way. But if you, when you think about post-colonial design, you have to think about post-colonial economies as well.
Yeah, that sounds.
So talk to me about that. What does that begin to look like? And how do we rewrite, or how do we write a new game?
So, like I mentioned, I think whether it's post-colonial economy or post-colonial politics, it means just including other voices, bringing other voices to have an active role, and to not only think in terms of, like you mentioned, quarterly, or like in politics in terms of one term, or the internet in seconds, or the stock market in seconds, milliseconds, but to think long term. And by doing so, not only think of the current economic gain, but of the gain that you can achieve 10, 20 years into the future. And to not only look at material capital, but relational capital, because we have to have some kind of connection to future generations, to also keep in mind what are their economic needs. So right now, what I'm observing is more of a rupture. Like you mentioned, people don't really think that many generations into the future. It seems almost surreal to think about what are their needs. But if we don't do it, then I don't know how we are going to tackle all the different issues that we're facing right now, especially climate change, etc.
Although, interestingly enough, when you're a new parent, you have that moment when you're holding your baby in your arms, and there's this. I remember when my son was born, this transformative shift of all of a sudden being able to understand the future in a very tangible way, and finding my life being reoriented toward planning and doing things with his future in mind, right? So like, okay, how do we prepare so he can go to college? How do we save money for this? And I continue to think that even though he's 20 years old, I still think about my actions, my decisions, and how it impacts his future. So I would think, how can we, for people who are, and this is not solely the domain of people who have children, but all of us are invested in the next generation. How do we hold that and operationalize that so it's top of mind, right? In terms of what we do. I'm imagining with you, like, okay, if we were to get a blank piece of paper and reimagine design thinking with this, because design thinking doesn't have a time scale. I just realized, oh gosh, it doesn't have a time scale at all. Oops. So how did that happen, right? Because it's all about innovate and fail fast and iterate, which has a utility, right? You just want to get to the right answer faster. And finance, Mark Nelson tells me that finance is merely pulling resources from the future into the present. That's all it is. It's this alchemy of how do I pull resources from the future into the present so you can build that future. So there's this exchange, this pump, right, of pulling into the future. So how would, if you had people representing these different generations, what would we need to do to get their consent to free up resources so we could build that future for them? If we actually had an active dialogue, and that would be an interesting reimagining of democracy.
Exactly. Imagine if you had future generations taking part into elections. Most elections, they think in terms of like getting the support for the term that they want to be voted in for. So if you had future generations or representatives representing future generations, it would change probably also the kind of topics that we would talk about and the significance of certain topics. However, what we are experiencing right now is kind of a colonization of the future, because we're treating it as something that is empty of time and empty of generations. And it's almost like this term that is used, that was used during colonial times when the British Empire in the 700s was colonizing Australia, or indigenous Aborigines. They were treating the space as terra nullius, nobody's land. But the same thing is happening right now with time. You call it tempus nullius. It's a time that is empty of anything, empty of generations. So we are colonizing it, treating it, exploiting its resources without thinking about the consequences. So I think really the aspect of time and the way we objectify or see other subjects, it really changes the narrative. And for instance, there's this tribe in Peru, which they're called Quechua. And what they think, they don't even have a word for object. They only have subject relationships. So for them, having a relationship with nature is grounded in equity, is very important for them. So I think we can learn so much from enlarging the discussion, inviting other ways of knowing into the way we do design thinking, because they can offer us no other new ways to find solutions. So instead of exporting the Western model of how we do design, which is kind of linear, you know, you have one step, then you do the next step, then you do the next step, and then you're finished, right? If you look at design thinking in terms of a circle, you know, because many cultures, they think in terms of circles as well. They don't think that time is linear. They think some cultures, they don't even have a term for future. They look backwards to look forwards. So traditions and everything that informs them, histories, that's what informs their decision making. So I think it's really interesting if we try and not only think as design thinking as something that is user-centered, that is just for a small group of people, or this kind of me thinking, but we, you know, to be inspired a bit of the relational capital that exists in many non-Western cultures, and how it can enrich the design process that we are accustomed to in design thinking. But I think that should definitely not be taken without a grain. So it's been seen as human-centered design, for instance, as the only way to do design thinking. But I think we've reached a point where we have to think about what's next. And whether it's environment-centered approach, there's other different traditions or discourses that centered around the same kind of subject. They're called life-centered design, multi-species design. It's this idea that we really need to include more actors into the discussion. And we should try and look also at designing for health, designing for helping people feel more known and valued, you know, understood, and this can also this doesn't exclude also designing something that can give you a profit, because if you can design something that can help more people feel good about themselves, you know, the one mantra of the PIN bootcamp that really touched me a lot. It inspires me, because this is really also what I would like to do if I would design peace tech, to design peace tech that helps more people feel valued, seen, understood. And who wouldn't want that? You know, who doesn't want to be understood? Who doesn't want to be seen as they want to be seen, or respected and valued? And yeah, not only invited, but part of the discussion. Because if you're invited, you can also be asked to leave, right? So, and if you're invited, you could just be there in terms of tokenism. But if you are part of the discussion, if you're owning the process, that changes everything. And I think
Yeah.
we should look at us designers not as creators, as owners of this process, but more as facilitators, as translators, because we speak with all the different actors, all the people who are together trying to make this process lead towards an aspiration, an outcome. I think we should question our own situatedness and always look at our own unconscious bias and how that influences what we do. And to always never think about designing as designing for, but designing for each other, with each other, by each other, you know, it's much more powerful, I think.
Yeah. So you've also been putting a considerable amount of your energy into ethical AI. And when you know, one of the things that Mark and I look at with great trepidation, well, any new emerging technology, you know, technology is like so many things in the world, it's morally neutral. I mean, so many things are just morally neutral. They're just, and it's what we do with it. And bad actors will do bad things, and good actors will do good things. And then there's the rest of us who we have good days and bad days, and we do good things and bad things, and that's most people. Um, and so now we have this AI, and it has all this great potential and all this negative potential. Tell me about the work that you're doing in terms of ethical AI, and what does ethics look like in the context of AI?
So I've recently been engaging with AI ethics, but specifically I've been looking at cultural AI ethics because I'm really interested in um, how different ways of knowing that are non-Western can have an influence on us understanding more what's going on with the AI. So when you look at AI, it's technology in general is not is often being seen as something neutral. And one problem with artificial intelligence, in my opinion, is the fact that it is not an artificial intelligence, but it's more like augmenting the capabilities of human beings. So it helps us to do things quicker, or it helps us to automate certain things that normally would take a lot of time for us to do. So, but the problem with AI is the fact that it is not neutral. The person who is creating the code, the algorithm, he himself can also kind of transfer his own unconscious bias into these products. So if you look at face recognition software, um, it uses a certain type of data set, which doesn't include all the varieties of human beings that exist, but has a considerable higher amount of Caucasian people and not so much data set on brown and black people. So what you can observe right now is also a movement called about the injustices that can happen because of it. So when you see face recognition software, it has really high difficulty at identifying black and brown faces, especially black and brown faces of women. So this is, I find, very curious why that is. And one explanation is, as I mentioned, that the data set is being created by people who are who are probably not part of this group, and that it is important, especially in AI, to be always aware of your own unconscious bias, of how you can influence um, the design process by your own situatedness. So this has been also a problem in terms of the criminal justice system, because a lot of decisions have been automated. So when it comes to deciding on sentencing or on identifying people who are seen as dangerous, a considerably higher amount of black and brown people are being identified as more dangerous or as people who are more prone to reoffend. So I think with AI ethics, it can help us to create guidelines to prevent these kind of actions from happening. But I think also what would be interesting in times like these where we have the coronavirus is to think of an AI ethics for urgencies. So AI ethics for situations where we don't have so much time to decide or to think about what kind of guidelines we have to develop, but we have to already think about AI ethics in terms of how it can how we can proactively design ethics into the design process from the beginning and not as an afterthought. So this is something I've been thinking about recently.
Right.
I think
So
it's
one of the areas where we get in trouble with AI is the training set, the
yeah.
training data. And of course, there was that, I'm sure you saw that article about the MIT training set that had so much bias and racism and misogyny in it. And it was a data set that was just, it was sort of like the standard data set that people used to train AI, right? And so it was like this poison that was infecting all the AI. I'm curious what a non-Western centric training data set would look like,
That is a very interesting question.
right? So say we decided to go into different indigenous communities in Latin America or in Africa that have non-Western cultures and said, okay, you're going to put together a training set. And what are the word associations that you make for all these objects and things?
Mm.
What would that look like? Right, in terms of how so it's like, okay, because that was part of it, is the with the training set was it was the word associations, right? So what are the attributes you associate with women or with black people or with brown people, and the stereotypes of the hate, and it was just stunning, right? But
Mm.
if you brought that to a non-Western culture and you had these people put together and say, what is the word association that you put with a woman or man, or or these animals or these plants? I'm curious what that would look like.
That is a very, very interesting thought experiment. I'm always wondering why is no one doing this, you know? Or is someone doing
Right. Yeah, well, maybe we can do it.
it? Yes.
Or
It would
maybe
be
some listeners can do it. It's like, that would be, why not?
because that's
Why
what
not?
AI needs. It needs a lot of a huge set of data to create this training data set. So I think this could be something. I think what we need to do is to include more diverse voices into the
Mm.
whole AI development process. So not to just have people from the West or the North, but to have also data scientists from West Africa, or data scientists from Asia, you know.
So part of it is also reimagining education, so post-colonial education, in a sense, is because again, everything, it's this whole intellectual heritage that keeps on being pushed forward, and just like, I didn't realize how Western I was until I went to India, right? It's like, I mean, because I just, you just did, like, I'm just me, right? And I'm Hispanic, and so I feel apart from like white Americans, just in terms of my upbringing and sensibility. And my mother wasn't born in the United States. She didn't speak English, and my father was from Arizona, Yaqui, so native. It's more of a different sensibility, again, not mainstream white. So I didn't think of myself as white, even though I grew up in California. And then I go to India and I go like, damn, I'm Western. Like, boom, right? Because India was so different, and how people interacted was so different, and the cultural values as they're expressed was so different. And it was just fascinating to me because I learned so much about myself because of the contrast,
Yeah.
right? And so even in our educational system, we are not aware of how embedded all these things are unless you actively study it. If you actively study Western culture and the intellectual heritage, and fewer and fewer students are doing that because they're more going into engineering or the sciences, so they're losing this blind spot in the humanities of where we came from and why we think the way we do.
Yeah.
Right? Much less how other people think. We
I
don't
think
understand how we think, and we completely don't understand how other
how
people
other
think.
people think, exactly. And I think your point is very, very important, that it starts with education, and that we should include in the curriculum non-Western thinkers, non-Western ways of thinking, so that people realize that it's not the only way to be. It's not the only way to think about the world. Like, I grew up in Germany, and my roots are in Nigeria. So I grew up really with these two cultures, you know, the Western way of being. And at the same time, you know, I remember being a young child, and my parents teaching me to treat every being as something that needs to be respected, not to just pull a leaf, and you know what children like to do, you know, they like to play with plants, but to respect it, and to recognize that it also has a life. So I think that is very powerful if you live grow up with the thinking that you have a relationship not only with other human beings, but also with other beings, and that they also need to be respected. I think it changes the way that you don't use the environment as an object that you can exploit, but as something that you need to take care of, something that needs to be looked after with care, but also with respect, not in an inferior power dynamic, but to really highlight the importance of equity and respect. I think that's something that we need across difference, you know, woman, man, all kinds of genders that exist, to acknowledge their existence and that they have a place in this world. I think this is significant. And if we include all these voices, like in the design process, it can change how we design for accessibility, for instance, you know. For instance, if you have like a webinar and you have a interpreter there, and also the captioning, it changes everything, because it includes more people who can follow the conversation. It makes it really inclusive, and I think we should aim in everything that we do. I think everyone is a designer, because we're all aiming to produce, or we all do something for an outcome. So whatever we do, we should try and think about how can we include more people into this. And wouldn't it be nice not to have people on the outside, but it's so much more powerful, I think.
Yeah. And certainly being on this side of the equation, our networks are so small. So, and certainly in the West, you see this problem in conferences where it's all male panels, and they go, well, I don't know any women, or they know the few women they know aren't available, or don't want to be the token woman on the panel because that's no fun.
I can imagine.
And so the dilemma is sort of like, how do we get connected to more people so that exchange is even possible? So so there's some structural barriers just in terms of our capacity to know a diverse group of people, and how do we, how do we create a context so that there is that contact and that interchange. And certainly digital technology should break those barriers down, especially now. I mean, everyone's a Zoom call away, and there are time differences, but we've learned to work around that. But it's still, I mean, there seems to be small things. How do it seems like, I know I'm repeating myself, but again, how do we mix it up more? And how do we get people to also how to appear? I've seen efforts where you're trying to reach out to people who are different from you and have it fail. So the other is and I'm looking at things, say, okay, what can I get involved in? How can I be in the room? And as you said, being invited also means that you can be disinvited.
Yeah.
All right, like they say, okay, we did that one time, we had her there, tick, and then and then done, right? Rather than being considered part of the community, part of that intellectual or creative community, that yes, we're not, it wasn't like a one-off, but that we actually act, because they'll tell you, we want you to participate, we want to hear your voice, and then the way the rules are set up, you don't get to speak. You go like, hello, and it's like,
I'm here. Yes.
I'm here. Oh, Margarita. Okay, so there are only 2 minutes left before the break. Yes, Margarita, what did you have to say? And I have had that happen to me, and I'm going like, this guy talked for 20 minutes, and I get 2 minutes, and there's going to be a hard break because we're going to break for lunch. Okay, I know that you really care about what I have to say.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think what you say is a very important point. That's why when we design for inclusion and diversity, we have to be aware of these things that happen very often, like in meetings where you have a situation where women talk considerably less or are not listened to as much. So we have to find ways to make people more aware of these things. We have to maybe design inclusivity, design diversity into the process, and not do it sporadically, but to really have it as a system, part of the whole way we organize meetings, the way we organize workshops, to always be aware that everyone is invited, and also has a voice.
Yeah.
It's very important, because like you mentioned, it's no fun to be invited, and maybe you're just a token person so that they can say, tick, you're there, but you can't actually speak. Or if you speak, it's been it feels almost out of place. It has to be it's about creating not a safe space, but a brave space, I think. What that means
I like that.
Yeah. I really
Yeah,
like
I
that
like
word.
that. Yeah, brave. I like
Brave
that.
space, yes. Because safe space is like everyone is looking after everybody's feelings, and no one really is brave enough maybe to say something that can provoke a little bit. So a brave space is a space where different points of view can collide, but it's not negative, because it creates new intelligence. It creates a shift, because if you're forced to listen to something that you're not used to, and that seems so out of the way that you see the world, it can help you to stop and think for a second and be like, oh, what does this person mean? And you can ask a question. And I think brave spaces are spaces where we can have an open conversation, where different points of view have a space and can be heard, and where we can have an exchange and learn to understand each other better. Because it's only through conversation, dialogue, that we can learn. Because it's not something that we just have in us to understand everyone, but it's just by listening, by learning, by empathizing, by asking questions. The why. Why do you think like this? Why is it like this? I don't understand why. I remember being a kid and always asking, Mom, why is it like this? Why does the world turn around? And it's very important to relearn to ask these why questions, and not to be scared. That any question is not a bad question, but a good question. So even a confrontation is something positive, because I think we learn something out of it. So, but not, of course, not a violent confrontation, but
Right. But it tells you that there's energy, right? And so how do you transform that energy into something productive, right? And sometimes you need energy to break. We need lots of energy to split an atom, right? You have to break those bonds, and they're like these intellectual molecules that also need to be broken apart.
And that's what innovation is,
right?
The disruption of the old, and restructuring or finding some new combinations that can help us see the world in a totally different way, and to develop something that didn't exist before. That's what design is, really. Innovation is to search for these kind of avenues that can help us find new connections, new solutions that didn't exist before, that can only exist by reimagining that exists already. So I think that's
Fantastic. So I'm going to ask you three things. Okay. What three things should the listener learn, change, or do?
very important. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Three things. I think the first one, one takeaway I would like people to remember is to practice awareness of unconscious bias and power dynamics that influence the design process. So that to be something that is not only in the beginning where you are conscious of it, but something that is there throughout. To be aware that you have your own situatedness. The second point would be that multiple futures can emerge from a way of thinking of the world as pluriversal rather than universal. So that by looking at the world as something that has a multitude of ways of being, that this creates possibilities beyond contemporary design. And the third one would be moving beyond human needs to include the larger ecosystem, like I mentioned, humans and non-humans, plants, animals, climate change, the ecosystem.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
these are the 3 points.
Beautiful. I love this. I
Thank
love
you.
all of this. Thank you so much for spending the
Thank you
time to
so
talk to
much.
me.
I really
Yeah.
love this.
Thank you. Okay. Right. So that wraps this talk. Brave space. That I'm going to be one of my big takeaways. This pluriversal way of seeing it, multiple futures, multiple present states as
Yes.
well, and really thinking about design in a not inclusive in the Western way, but inclusive in a non-Western way, I think could be really profound. Thank you, Aishatu, for your great work, and I'm looking forward to seeing your reinvention of design thinking.
Thank you so much.